In this presentation, we will be looking into the concept of profit maximization. Included in this discussion, we will consider the short term and long term, keying on whether, when, or if a firm should shut down its operations. What this will illustrate to the viewer is how important a role prices play in markets. While our presentations in economics tend to be rather static, it's absolutely important that we understand that prices are always shifting depending upon market fluctuations. Having said that, let's begin with a model with a downward sloping demand curve. A downward sloping demand curve for a firm indicates that the market is less than perfectly competitive. An example of this downward sloping demand curve is a monopolistically competitive market as described by Joan Robinson. This is due to product differentiation typically. In this first example, we have a firm then that is in a less than perfectly competitive market. In maximizing profit, let's consider how the following are related: price and marginal revenue, price and marginal cost and marginal revenue, and finally price and average cost. First, you'll note in moving left to right from the y-axis rather, or the vertical axis, that the price line crosses the marginal revenue curve past the marginal cost curve. The profit maximizing point is where the marginal revenue curve crosses the marginal cost curve. It is at this profit maximizing point that we drop down to the x-axis, the horizontal axis, or the quantity axis, to determine the profit maximizing quantity to produce. Likewise, moving up from the intersection of the marginal revenue curve and marginal cost curve to the average revenue curve or demand curve, this is where the price is determined by drawing a horizontal line, again parallel to the x-axis, over to the y-axis or the vertical axis or the price axis. Now in this next graphic, we switch our focus to the short run, the long run, and the shutdown points respectively. At this juncture, let me point out a few things of note. 1. The marginal revenue line bisects the average revenue line. It begins at the same point on the y-axis in the upper left-hand corner and moving down to the point where it meets the x-axis. It remains 1/2 of the average revenue or demand curve. 2. Profit maximization occurs where the marginal revenue curve cuts the marginal cost curve. At the intersection, you drop down vertically to the x-axis to determine the profit maximizing quantity, and you go up to the average revenue curve or the demand curve, and then over to the y-axis or the price axis to determine the profit maximizing price. Cost curves, third, cost curves are broken down into marginal cost, average variable cost, average fixed cost, and average total cost, which combines variable and fixed cost. It is also important to note that the marginal cost curve crosses the average total cost curve at its lowest point. First, when we are considering the composition of cost, we separate them in terms of, again, fixed cost, those costs that remain the same regardless of the level of production, and variable costs, those costs which increase as production increases. When we consider average cost, we find that fixed cost on a per unit basis diminishes as the production ramps up, while variable cost varies. In arriving at total cost, more specifically average total cost, we combine fixed and variable cost. At first, both variable and fixed costs fall. But after reaching its low point, average total costs begin to rise, in spite of the fact that average fixed costs continue to fall. The decision to shut down an operation is dependent upon the following. First, if you are covering your average variable cost, regardless of your ability to cover your average total cost, you should remain open, at least in the short run. This is due to the fact that while you might not be covering your average fixed cost, you will have to pay that portion of your cost whether you are operating or not. 2. If you're not even covering all of your average variable cost, you should immediately shut down your operation. This is fairly straightforward. If you're not, again, even covering the cost of paying for your materials and labor, for example, there's no sense in keeping your doors open. Now, the ideal is that you're covering your average cost, meaning your average fixed cost, average total cost rather, meaning your average fixed cost and your average variable cost, and they are below the average revenue curve. What's important to note here is the distinction between the short run and the long run. Simply put, the short run focuses on covering your variable cost with at least some of your fixed costs, if at all possible. The long run, meanwhile, depends on covering all cost, average total cost, that is. There's an expression used in economics, and it goes, in the long run, all costs are variable. What this refers to is that the more units that are produced, the smaller the average fixed cost becomes, to the point where it becomes asymptotic, or the difference is so small that it is virtually the same or coincident as the average variable cost or average total cost. In summary, we have three scenarios. First, average variable cost is below the average revenue curve or demand curve. In this case, the firm will continue to operate in the short run since it is at least covering its variable cost. An example of this might be an older production facility that would continue to operate until at such time it needed to expand or make significant capital improvements such as machinery and equipment. In the short run, it would remain open, but if it was moving to the long run, it would shut down. Second, average total cost is at or below the average revenue or demand curve. In this case, the firm will continue to operate in the short run and also likely in the long run since it is covering all of its costs, both variable and fixed. An example of this might be a profitable firm that wants to expand its facility or perhaps replace or update equipment. While fixed cost will be added, we are assuming that the average total cost will remain at or below the average revenue curve or demand curve. Finally, number three, the immediate shutdown. Average variable cost in this case is above the average revenue curve or demand curve. In this case, the firm will shut down immediately since it cannot even cover its variable cost. This can be caused by a variety of factors, including a drop in the price level, something significant, an increase in cost, variable cost in particular, a shift in demand, or any combination of the three.